The story of Condoleezza Rice begins in the deep, resonant heart of the American South, in Birmingham, Alabama, during a time when the air was thick with both the promise of change and the heavy weight of segregation. She was born in 1954, the very year the Supreme Court declared segregated schools unconstitutional in Brown v. Board of Education, a ruling that would send tremors through her hometown but would not immediately break its hardened surface. Her parents, Angelina and John Wesley Rice Jr., were educators of formidable intellect and determination, who believed utterly in the power of knowledge and discipline to arm their only child against the world's constraints. They created for her a sanctuary of high culture and high expectations within the walls of their home in Titusville, a middle-class black neighborhood that stood as a proud bulwark against the indignities of Jim Crow. Here, the melodies were not just those she practiced on the family's grand piano, but the constant, reassuring hum of ambition and love. From her earliest days, Condoleezza was immersed in a world of books, music, and ideas. Her name, derived from the Italian musical term condolcezza, meaning with sweetness, was a testament to her parents' refined aspirations. Piano lessons began at age 3, and the rigorous discipline of practice, scales, arpeggios, complex sonatas, became the rhythm of her childhood. This was not merely a hobby, it was training in focus, in excellence, and in the expression of emotion through structured form. The family would often travel to Nashville to visit her mother's family, where the atmosphere was similarly charged with intellectual pursuit. Her grandfather having built a legacy as a Presbyterian minister and educator who saved cotton pickers' wages to fund his own college education. Yet, outside the sanctuary of home and church, the reality of Birmingham in the late 1950s and early 1960s was stark and often dangerous. The city was so notoriously segregated it had earned the grim nickname Birmingham. Condoleezza attended school with other black children in a separate and unequal system, though her parents ensured her academic journey was accelerated and enriched. She was a keen student, skipping both the 1st and 7th grades, her mind always racing ahead. The civil rights movement was not a distant news story, it was the backdrop of her youth. She knew the 4 little girls, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley, and Addie Mae Collins, who were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in 1963. She was just 8 years old, and the explosion shattered the morning, sending a shockwave of grief and terror through her community. That horrific event, a defining tragedy of the era, left an indelible mark. In her own recollections, Rice has spoken of the sound of the blast, the panic, and the profound sense of loss that settled over Titusville. It was a brutal lesson in the high stakes of the struggle unfolding around her. Her parents, while deeply involved in the community, protected her from direct activism, fearing for her safety. Instead, they doubled down on their philosophy of preparation. They taught her that to navigate a world that might set limits based on her race or gender, she would need to be twice as good, a mantra of many black families of the time. This instilled not a sense of grievance, but one of profound personal responsibility and agency. The Rice household was also a place of political discourse, though of a particular kind. Her father, a Republican and a staunch believer in self-reliance and military strength, engaged in lively debates with friends. Condoleezza listened, absorbing discussions about international affairs and the nation's role in the world, even as the domestic battle for rights raged outside. This unique dual perspective, the intimate knowledge of America's deepest flaw and a burgeoning interest in its global power, would later define her worldview. Her childhood, therefore, was a complex symphony, the disciplined melody of piano practice, the dissonant chords of racial violence, and the harmonious tones of familial love and unwavering belief. Ultimately, the foundation laid in Birmingham was unshakable. It was a childhood that cultivated resilience, intellectual curiosity, and a performance-ready poise. When the family moved to Denver, Colorado, in 1969 for her father to take a university administrative post, Condoleezza entered a new, integrated environment. She was 15, entering the 11th grade, armed with the formidable education and inner strength forged in the heat of Alabama. The melodies of Birmingham, of struggle, of culture, of high expectation, traveled with her, a permanent internal score that would guide her through the halls of higher education and, eventually, to the highest corridors of power. Her story is a testament to how a sheltered world, built with deliberate care within a turbulent one, can produce a spirit capable of engaging with the most complex global stages. The transition from the charged atmosphere of Birmingham to the sprawling, sun-drenched campus of Stanford University in the early 1970s marked the beginning of Condoleezza Rice's formal intellectual odyssey. She arrived as a freshman, a talented pianist still contemplating a professional music career, and she would leave nearly 2 decades later as a tenured professor of political science, her path having been irrevocably altered by a single, captivating class. Initially majoring in music, she pursued her studies with the same discipline learned at her family's piano, but found herself increasingly drawn to other fields, feeling the pull of history and politics that had always simmered in the background of her life. It was a time of great change on campuses nationwide, and Stanford was no exception, buzzing with debates over the Vietnam War, civil rights, and the role of the academy. Her academic turning point came in an international politics course taught by a young Soviet specialist named Joseph Korbel, the father of a future Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. Korbel, a Czech diplomat who had fled communism twice, brought the Cold War to life not as an abstract ideological struggle, but as a deeply human drama with real consequences for nations and individuals. For Rice, this was an electrifying revelation. The intricate, high-stakes game of international relations, with its focus on military power, diplomatic strategy, and grand historical narratives, captivated her in a way that music's solitary practice no longer did. Under Korbel's mentorship, she switched her major to political science, finding in the study of the Soviet Union a subject that demanded rigor and offered profound insights into the nature of power. Excelling with remarkable speed, Rice graduated at age 19 and proceeded directly to a PhD program at the University of Notre Dame. Her dissertation focused on the Czechoslovak army and its political role, a topic that allowed her to delve into archives and refine her expertise on communist military institutions. Earning her doctorate by the age of 26, she then returned to Stanford in 1981 as a fellow, and soon joined the political science faculty as an assistant professor. Her scholarly work was sharp, clear-eyed, and respected, particularly her analyses of the Soviet military and its influence on political decision-making. In the lecture hall, she was known for a commanding yet accessible teaching style, able to distill complex geopolitical concepts into understandable lessons, a skill honed perhaps from years of explaining musical composition. Her rise within Stanford's often insular academic world was steady. She earned tenure, a significant achievement that secured her place in the academy and became a respected voice on security affairs. Yet, the university offered more than just a classroom podium. It was also her first arena for administrative leadership. In 1987, she was tapped to serve as an assistant to the provost, gaining crucial experience in the mechanics of institutional governance, budgeting, and academic policy. This role revealed a new dimension of her capabilities, not just as a thinker, but as an executor and a manager of complex systems. It was a formative apprenticeship in the art of leadership outside the purely intellectual realm. Parallel to her academic career, Rice began to step into the world of Washington policy. In the mid-1980s, she spent a year as a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and later worked on the Joint Chiefs of Staff as an intern, bringing her scholarly knowledge of the Soviet military into the actual Pentagon. These experiences bridged the gap between theory and practice, allowing her to see how academic insights could inform real-world strategy. She returned to Stanford with a broader perspective, but the pull of policy would only grow stronger. Her reputation as a brilliant, pragmatic, and tough-minded analyst on Soviet affairs made her a sought-after voice as the Cold War entered its astonishing final act. The Stanford Years, stretching from undergraduate to tenured professor, were the essential incubator for Condoleezza Rice's public life. The campus provided the space for her intellectual transformation from musician to Sovietologist, the platform for her to develop an authoritative voice, and the training ground for her initial forays into administration. It was here she built the foundational expertise and professional credibility that would make her a natural candidate for public service when the call came. The groves of academe were not an escape from the world, but a vital observation post and preparation center, where she studied the chessboard of global politics before being asked to make a move herself. When she finally left Stanford for Washington, she did not leave as an academic entering politics, but as a scholar-statesperson whose entire career had been a preparation for that moment. Long before the Iron Curtain fell, Condoleezza Rice was developing a deep, analytical understanding of the Soviet system, establishing herself as one of a new generation of experts who looked beyond ideology to examine the hard levers of power. Her scholarly focus was deliberate and specific. She was fascinated not by the rhetoric of Marxism-Leninism, but by the concrete institutions that sustained the Soviet state, particularly its military and the relationship between armed force and political control. This approach set her apart in an academic field often dominated by theorists. She was a pragmatist, interested in how the machine actually worked, where its stresses were, and how it might ultimately fail. Her doctoral work on the Czechoslovak army was a precursor, a case study in how a military apparatus could be both a tool of empire and a potential site of political vulnerability. Upon joining Stanford's faculty, Rice immersed herself in the archives and debates surrounding Soviet security policy. She learned Russian, a critical tool that allowed her to engage with primary sources and communicate with émigrés, gaining insights that were not filtered through Western preconceptions. Her research probed the mindset of the Soviet High Command, analyzing their doctrine, their influence on arms control negotiations, and their role in Kremlin politics. In books and articles, she argued that the Soviet military was a more professional and potentially more politically significant actor than many Western analysts assumed. This work was characterized by a clear, unsentimental prose and a refusal to either demonize or romanticize her subject. She treated the Soviet Union as a formidable, complex adversary to be understood, not merely as an evil empire to be condemned. The late 1980s presented the ultimate test for any Sovietologist, as Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika began to unravel the very system scholars had spent decades dissecting. For Rice, this was a period of intense observation and revised analysis. Unlike some who believed the Soviet system could reform itself, she remained skeptical of its long-term viability, understanding the deep structural contradictions between its centralized economic control and its geopolitical ambitions. She watched as Gorbachev's attempts to modernize the economy and loosen political controls inadvertently released nationalist tensions in the republics and exposed the system's profound weaknesses. Her expertise became invaluable not just in academic journals, but in policy circles trying to navigate this unpredictable transformation. It was during this pivotal time that her path intersected with that of another key figure in American foreign policy, Brent Scowcroft, the former National Security Advisor. Serving on a bipartisan commission he chaired in the mid-1980s, Rice impressed Scowcroft with her incisive knowledge and cool demeanor. When George H.W. Bush was elected president in 1988 and asked Scowcroft to return as National Security Advisor, Scowcroft knew he needed a top-notch Soviet expert on his staff. He recruited Condoleezza Rice to serve as the director and later senior director of Soviet and East European Affairs on the National Security Council. This move catapulted her from the lecture hall to the Situation Room. At the NSC, her scholarly work transitioned from theory to immediate practice. She was now at the nerve center of American policy during the most dramatic geopolitical shift since World War II. Her task was to provide the president and his advisors with clear, actionable analysis as the Warsaw Pact dissolved, the Berlin Wall fell, and the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Her memoranda and briefings were valued for their clarity and lack of ideological baggage. She advocated for a steady, firm approach that supported democratic movements without recklessly provoking a reaction from Soviet hardliners, helping to craft a policy that managed a peaceful end to the Cold War. It was the ultimate validation of her academic focus. Understanding the Soviet system's internal pressures was key to navigating its collapse without catastrophe. Thus, Condoleezza Rice's identity as a scholar of the Soviet Union was never a purely academic pursuit. It was the foundational expertise that qualified her for history's stage. Her years of studying the Kremlin's corridors of power from a distance prepared her to walk the corridors of the West Wing when those two worlds collided. She exemplified the vital role of the area specialist, the scholar whose deep, nuanced understanding of a foreign culture and its power structures becomes an indispensable asset in moments of international crisis and transformation. Her journey from Stanford to the White House was a direct line drawn by her mastery of a subject that, for a critical period, defined the world. The election of George W. Bush in 2000 marked Condoleezza Rice's return to the epicenter of American power, this time in a role of unparalleled proximity and influence. Appointed as National Security Advisor, she became the principal coordinator of the foreign policy apparatus and the daily conduit of global affairs to the president. Her office in the West Wing basement, though windowless, was a crossroads of the world, a place where military commanders, intelligence chiefs, diplomats, and cabinet secretaries flowed through to shape the administration's strategic vision. Her relationship with President Bush was one of notable trust and intellectual alignment. They shared a similar clarity of thought, a preference for decisive action, and a worldview shaped by a belief in American power and the transformative potential of freedom. The early months of the administration were consumed by crafting a coherent post-Cold War foreign policy, with a focus on great power relations, missile defense, and managing a rising China. Rice helped articulate a policy that moved beyond the containment of the previous era toward a more assertive posture. Then, on a clear September morning in 2001, the world shattered. Rice was in her West Wing office when the attacks unfolded. Her immediate role was one of crisis manager, coordinating information flow, ensuring the president's security, and beginning the process of formulating a response. The attacks instantly redefined the administration's priorities and her own job, catapulting the threat of transnational terrorism to the very top of the security agenda. In the aftermath of 9/11, Rice became a key architect of what would become known as the Bush Doctrine, which emphasized preemptive action against emerging threats and the promotion of democracy as an antidote to terrorism. She was a steady, public-facing explainer of this bold and controversial strategy, appearing on Sunday talk shows and before congressional committees to articulate the administration's case. Her calm, academic demeanor provided a measured tone for policies that were inherently revolutionary. She worked tirelessly to build international coalitions for the invasion of Afghanistan to dismantle al-Qaeda and overthrow the Taliban regime that harbored them, a mission that initially commanded broad global support. The subsequent decision to invade Iraq in 2003 would become the defining and most contentious foreign policy event of the administration. Rice was a central player in the deliberations leading up to the war, advocating strongly for action based on intelligence assessments, later proven flawed, that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and posed a grave threat. She famously used the phrase mushroom cloud in a television interview to illustrate the potential danger of inaction, a rhetorical moment that came to symbolize the administration's case. Her role involved coordinating the diplomatic push for a United Nations resolution, managing relations with wary allies, and planning for the post-war occupation, an area where the administration's preparations would later be widely criticized as catastrophically insufficient. Beyond the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Rice's tenure as National Security Advisor involved managing a vast portfolio. She navigated a tense relationship with a newly assertive Vladimir Putin in Russia, sought to engage India as a strategic partner, and attempted to balance engagement with China alongside concerns over its human rights record and military expansion. Throughout, she operated as an honest broker within the administration, a role Brent Scowcroft had emphasized to her, tasked with presenting the president with all policy options and viewpoints from the various departments, state, defense, CIA, without undue bias. This required formidable bureaucratic skill and personal authority to manage the strong personalities and interagency rivalries that are a constant feature of Washington. Serving as National Security Advisor was a relentless, all-consuming undertaking. It demanded 12-hour days, constant vigilance, and the emotional fortitude to bear the weight of decisions with life-and-death consequences. For Rice, it was the ultimate application of a lifetime of study. The strategic concepts she had taught at Stanford were now operational realities. The historical analogies she had cited in lectures were now living reference points for contemporary crisis. Her journey from a scholar analyzing the use of force to an advisor recommending its use was complete. The West Wing years forged her in the fire of unprecedented crisis, cementing her public identity as a figure of formidable intellect and unflappable poise, and setting the stage for her next, even more visible role on the global diplomatic stage. In January 2005, Condoleezza Rice was sworn in as the 66th Secretary of State, becoming the first African-American woman to hold the office. The ceremony was a historic moment, a powerful symbol of progress that resonated from the segregated Birmingham of her childhood to the Benjamin Franklin room of the State Department. Her mandate, however, was daunting: to steer American diplomacy through the turbulent aftermath of the Iraq invasion, to repair alliances strained by the war, and to advance a freedom agenda in a world growing increasingly skeptical of American power. She took the helm with a clear vision, declaring that the goal of U.S. foreign policy must be to build and sustain a world of democratic, well-governed states. Rice immediately embarked on a grueling pace of travel that would become a hallmark of her tenure, logging nearly 1 million miles to 85 countries. She believed in the power of personal diplomacy, of looking leaders in the eye, of listening, of building relationships. Her first major task was what she termed transformational diplomacy, an effort to move beyond merely managing relations with other governments and instead work to transform the societies themselves through support for democratic institutions, civil society, and economic reform. This involved a controversial restructuring of the State Department itself, shifting diplomats from comfortable European posts to emerging strategic hubs in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, aiming to deploy America's diplomatic resources where the challenges of the 21st century were most acute. A significant early test was managing the complex relationship with a rising China. Rice pursued a pragmatic policy of engagement, encouraging China's integration into the international system as a responsible stakeholder, while maintaining a strong security presence in Asia to reassure allies. She navigated crises such as North Korea's nuclear tests, working through the stalled six-party talks in an attempt to achieve a diplomatic solution to Pyongyang's weapons program. In the Middle East beyond Iraq, she invested considerable personal effort in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, shuttling between leaders to promote a two-state solution. While a major breakthrough remained elusive, her sustained engagement kept the issue on the agenda during a period of deep division, following the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the electoral victory of Hamas. Perhaps one of her most notable diplomatic achievements was the negotiation of the U.S.-India Civil Nuclear Agreement. This groundbreaking deal, finalized in 2008, ended decades of nuclear isolation for India and forged a new strategic partnership with the world's largest democracy. It required immense diplomatic skill to navigate non-proliferation concerns, persuade a skeptical U.S. Congress, and secure approval from the International Nuclear Suppliers Group. The agreement was a concrete example of her philosophy of building relationships with emerging democratic powers to shape the international order. Similarly, she worked to strengthen ties with traditional allies in Europe, mending fences after the Iraq Rift by emphasizing shared values and common threats. Rice's tenure was also marked by significant humanitarian and development initiatives. She was a forceful advocate within the administration for a massive increase in funding to combat HIV/AIDS in Africa through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, a program that has saved millions of lives. She championed aid for war-torn Lebanon and supported independence for Kosovo. However, her diplomacy faced severe headwinds from ongoing violence in Iraq, the resurgence of the Taliban in Afghanistan, and, in 2008, a Russian invasion of Georgia that challenged post-Cold War security assumptions. Each crisis demanded a response that balanced principle with pragmatism, often under the harsh glare of global media scrutiny. Through it all, Rice carried herself with a signature combination of academic precision and Southern grace. She could discuss Byzantine points of international law with experts, then sit down at a piano to play a piece by Brahms for a visiting dignitary. This multifaceted persona, the serious strategist and the cultured pianist, became a unique asset in the diplomatic toolkit. Her journey as Secretary of State was one of relentless motion and formidable ambition, an attempt to channel American power toward a vision of a more democratic world. While history's judgment on the policies of that era remains complex and debated, her role as a trailblazer and a principal architect of that era's diplomacy is indelible. She left the State Department having reshaped its mission and having demonstrated, on the world's most visible stage, the profound capabilities she had cultivated since those first piano lessons in Birmingham. With the change of administration in January 2009, Condoleezza Rice's intense 8-year journey through the highest levels of the U.S. government came to a close. She returned to California, not to the quiet life of a retired professor, but to a new chapter of multifaceted influence centered once more at Stanford University. Her official title was Professor of Political Science and, notably, Professor at the Graduate School of Business. She also took on the role of Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, a public policy think tank on campus. This return was a homecoming to the world of ideas, but she arrived with the unparalleled practical experience of having helped steer the ship of state through war and peace. Her classroom lectures were no longer theoretical explorations of power. They were now enriched by first-hand accounts from the Situation Room and private conversations in world capitals. At the Graduate School of Business, Rice co-taught a wildly popular course on strategic leadership with former colleague and Stanford professor, Joel Peterson. The course used case studies from history, business, and her own experiences to examine how leaders make decisions under uncertainty, manage crises, and build effective teams. Students packed the auditorium to hear her dissect the complexities of the 9/11 response, the deliberations leading to the Iraq War, or the negotiations for the India nuclear deal. She spoke with candor about the weight of responsibility, the inevitability of imperfect information, and the loneliness of ultimate decision-making. This was not a victory lap, but a reflective, pedagogical effort to distill lessons for the next generation of leaders in all fields. Beyond the classroom, Rice embraced her role as a public intellectual and author. She penned 2 memoirs, Extraordinary, Ordinary People, a memoir of family, a heartfelt tribute to her parents and her upbringing in Birmingham, and No Higher Honor, a memoir of my years in Washington. A detailed account of her service as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. These books provided her narrative of the events that defined an era, offering insights into the personalities, debates, and pivotal moments from her unique vantage point. She also became a frequent commentator on political and international affairs, her opinions still sought after by media outlets and conference organizers around the globe. Her commitment to education, a family legacy, took on new forms. She served on various boards and became actively involved in initiatives promoting school choice and educational reform, arguing passionately that the civil rights issue of today is access to a quality education for every child. She also returned to music with renewed joy, performing publicly with cellist Yo-Yo Ma and occasionally with the San Francisco Symphony. The piano, once a childhood discipline, was now a source of solace and creative expression, a tangible link to the world her parents built for her. She even served for a time on the board of the San Francisco Symphony, merging her cultural and civic interests. Rice also accepted positions on corporate boards, including those of Dropbox and the global asset management firm, McKenna Capital, applying her understanding of global risk, governance, and strategy to the business world. These roles kept her engaged with the cutting edge of technology and finance, sectors critical to American competitiveness. Despite her full private life, rumors and occasional draft movements sought to draw her back into electoral politics, most notably as a potential vice presidential or presidential candidate. She consistently demurred, expressing no interest in running for office, preferring the platforms of academia, writing, and selective corporate governance. Life back at the farm, a nickname for Stanford, has thus been a rich tapestry of reflection, teaching, and continued service. It represents the closing of a circle, but not an end. Condoleezza Rice's post-Washington years demonstrate how a lifetime of public service can flow productively back into the spheres of education and thought leadership. She transitioned from being a maker of history to being one of its most insightful teachers and interpreters. The young girl who was taught to be twice as good in Birmingham, who analyzed Soviet power at Stanford, and who helped guide America through a transformative and traumatic decade, now spends her days ensuring that the lessons of that remarkable journey are not lost, but are studied, debated, and built upon by those who will shape the decades to come.